But because it was a serial killer case and we had physical evidence from each case, we had 5 cases in all, and we had physical evidence. One of the prosecutors said, let's try this DNA thing. So sure enough.
So did you have a coffee can in the car, or
Yes.
did you like public indecency where you had to go into the trees?
Both. We did plenty of both. But yes, you had to keep a can with you in the car, because sometimes when you're on point, you're the point man. You can't get out and go. They bore a hole in the back of the trunk, and they would lay down in the back seat of the car and shoot that rifle outside that hole.
Steve Neal, how you doing, sir?
Yes, sir. Doing great. How you doing?
Fine. After all that technical problems we had, we got it going, baby.
We're ready to go now.
Well, you're in Virginia.
Yes, sir. I'm in Chesterfield, Virginia, which we're a suburban location right between Richmond and Petersburg.
Chesterfield County Police Department was your first agency?
It was actually my only agency. I've worked there almost 30 years and retired from them. Chesterfield County Police Department.
How big is the county? You probably cover a lot of territory there.
It is. It's a large mileage-wise county, but right now it's about 420,000 people. So it's a good-sized jurisdiction. Chesterfield County is about a 600-person police department. They've got about 500 sworn and about 120 or so civilians that work for them. So it's a good-sized operation.
And what were your positions on this department?
Well, I was lucky. I got to do just about everything. Of course, I came in as a uniform officer, which is pretty typical, and ended up being a detective and worked juvenile sex crimes, where kids were the victims of sex crimes. Also worked a lot of other persons type crimes during that time, whether it be robbery, rape, murder, whatever it happened to be. And got promoted to sergeant. I worked the uniform again as sergeant. And then I got to work at Covert surveillance team for 5 years as a sergeant. That was absolutely my favorite assignment of my whole career. No question about it. We got a chance to really work on some bad guys, and it was fun and it was impactful as well. So I was a lieutenant. I did just about everything: uniform, communications, you name it. As a lieutenant, and then a captain. I was director of training. Worked as a watch commander for a while at night, and then I retired out of the support services, which some people would call McGruff, but it has to do with school resource officers and a lot of stuff like that.
So what made you become the police?
Well, that's an interesting story, a little bit different than the average person. I was a young kid. I was growing up in Louisville, Kentucky. We had no contact with police at all, no family members, nothing, just an average blue-collar kid growing up. Played basketball, and when I just turned 18 years old, some of my friends called me and asked me if I wanted to go play basketball. So I said, sure, let's go. So I got in the car with 3 of my friends, and next thing you know, my friend that was driving put on a mask, and one of these things that covers over your head, full face mask, and he wore a baseball cap and a cigarette, and he said, let's go have some fun. And I was riding in the back seat of the car. It's all I did, ride in the back seat of the car. But anyway, started making comments to people, stupid stuff like young kids would do. It wasn't like some mature 17 and 18-year-olds by any means. We thought it was funny, but there was a bank teller at a strip mall that didn't think it was quite so funny. So that bank teller, unbeknownst to us, called the police and said that there was 4 men with masks and guns that were getting ready to rob the bank. And as you can imagine, the police took that very seriously. So next thing you know, we had 15 or so police cars on us, guns. Everybody was up, agitated, uptight, don't move, we're going to kill you and all that. They jerked us out of the car, roughed us up a little bit, threw us down on the ground, and took us to the police substation. Had these 4 bank robbers that they were going to interrogate. Well, of course, it didn't take long for them to figure out that we weren't trying to rob a bank. We were just stupid teenagers that were doing dumb stuff. So all of my buddies, all 3 of them got released, and I got taken to the county jail since I was 18 years old. So I spent some time there, didn't like it, and didn't like the whole process, and ended up in the long run going to court and beating the case. But I had a lot of anger built up in me about that. I didn't like the way it happened at all. So it took me about 3 years to settle down. But once I did, I made a decision, I need to get in this business, get in law enforcement, and see if I can make a difference. And that's what I did my whole career. That was my motivation for being a cop.
when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I was in the park behind my house. Is a big park, real big park with a beach and everything. And we were playing around the water fountain. You know, it was just a water fountain that came straight up. And they were all 9, 10-year-old boys, you know, and we were squirting each other. I was getting squirted. Finally, I got my turn there, and these guys all took off. And then all of a sudden, somebody grabs me from behind. It was the park cop, who was really a Chicago policeman. And he took me into this office in this boiler room building from the field house. And he just scared the hell out of me for 15 minutes, telling me he's going to tell my father. And I never forgot that. And I always thought about that every time I got a young kid. You're absolutely right. That stuff sticks with you.
Well, and see, you know, what happened to me, I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. I thought it was inappropriate. Didn't like getting roughed up. Didn't like spending time in jail. And I just didn't like the whole process. But it actually impacted me in a very positive way, because every time I dealt with somebody for 30 years, I knew what it felt like to be on the other side of that gun. And I knew what it felt like to be roughed up by the police. So it actually made me a much better cop. Your story you told reminds me of a funny story with me. And if you don't mind, I'll
Sure,
share it.
go ahead, man. That's why we're here.
Yeah, it's, you know, most time young officers, you go into the academy and all that stuff, you get trained and all. The officers, young ones, talk to each other, you know, when's your first pursuit and that kind of stuff. Well, every time somebody asked me when my first police pursuit was, I said it's when I was 5 years old. And they said, what? I said, yeah, when I was 5 years old, I was out in the yard at dusk one night, and for some reason or another, I saw a police car go by, and I thought it would be a good idea to pick up a rock and throw it at that police car. And as a 5-year-old, I zinged that rock. I hit the car. I was a good athlete even back then. I hit the police car as it was going by, and they slammed on brakes and started backing up to come get me, and I took off. I took off running, and I went and hid, and they came looking for me, shining lights all around and all that, but I was hid under a tarp in the shed. I'd jumping fences and all sorts. So my first police pursuit, I wasn't but 5 years old.
Oh, so you have a very long criminal record.
You're right. Right. Exactly right. And so, well, the funny thing is, like a lot of kids, I did a whole lot of stuff when I was growing up that I could have got arrested for, but I never was. The only time I was arrested, I was riding in the backseat of a car.
So you mentioned something. When I made detective, there was a test they gave, and it was a combination detective youth officer test. I passed the exam, and I was on the list. And they said, what do you want to be, a detective or a youth officer? And there was no question in my mind. I did not want to be a youth officer, not because I didn't want to deal with kids, but because I thought that there was going to be a lot of days I came home not feeling too good because of what happens to kids. And that's what you live. How long did you do that?
I did that for 3 years, and I can tell you, you don't need to do that job much longer than that, because it really does impact you psychologically. And of course, usually you're younger, and I had children myself at the time. It made me very weary. And, you know, what you see and hear when you work sex crimes, especially with children, is absolutely sickening. It's stuff that will turn your stomach. And in fact, the more crazy and wild and outrageous the story the kid tells you, the more likely it is going to be true.
Yeah.
So some of these things that happen to some of these children, it shouldn't happen. And it's absolutely horrendous. So after just a very few years, you really need to get out of that and go to something else, because it can change the way you look at the world.
Another police group on Facebook, a policeman I knew back in the day posted. He was a younger guy. He just retired. And he said a few years ago, he said he still has bad dreams. And there's a lot of things you see. No question. I still, even to this day, still have some bad dreams about different things that I've seen through the course of the career, like every other career policeman. We've been exposed to a lot of things that they're not fit for human consumption. You know, whether it be somebody that cuts their head off with a meat saw, which I've been to that scene before, or whether see people that have been hit by trains or suicides, homicide, you name it. There's a lot of stuff that you see that it's not fit for the human mind, and it's not something that's good for you. So
I think the quicker you can leave that, the better. But sometimes it stays with you. I still have dreams about some of that stuff even today.
So you did some undercover surveillance. Was that surveillance?
It was. That was the greatest job in the world. And if anybody ever gets a chance to do that, I highly recommend it.
Well, what
it's
is it? What is the job? Explain it.
Well, it's another funny story about that. I was a sergeant. I'd been a sergeant in uniform for a couple of years, and I got a message to go see the chief, and that was very unusual. We had a large department. We didn't go see the chief. I mean, we didn't have daily interaction or anything. That was very unusual. So I went to see the chief, and he says, "Look, we're going to make a bunch of transfers, promotions, this, that, and the other." And he says, "How would you like to do covert work?" So I said, "Well, chief, are you asking me or are you telling me?" And he said, "Well, I'm asking you. I want to know what you think about it. How would you like to do some covert work?" And I said, "Chief, I don't know anything about it. I've got young children. I've never had any experience with it." I said, "I really would rather not." And he said, "Okay, well, report there Monday at 8 o'clock. That's your new assignment." So
you got it anyway.
So I got it anyway. Now,
no was not an acceptable answer.
Yeah, he already knew what he was going to do. So turns out I did that for 5 years. It was the greatest job in the world. We had one sergeant, we had 7 detectives, and our job was to target the worst of the worst. We targeted our high offenders, sometimes whether they be fugitives or whether they be people that we knew were doing bad things. We paid close attention to the releases from prison, those that just came out of prison. And we would target a bad guy that we knew were doing robberies or were doing rape or break-ins or whatever it was. And we locked on them, and we stayed on them until we caught them doing a crime. So we lived when they lived. We went to bed when they went to bed. And usually it would only take us a few days, and we would watch them do a robbery or a burglary or whatever it happens to be. And we catch them in the act, and then they're gone back to prison. They're gone at that point because we got a strong case against them and got some good evidence. So I did that for 5 years, and it was really the most fun job.
How was the food? I mean, you're eating pizza all the time, I imagine, right?
Yeah, that was the only downside to it. The hours were long, and we were on a anytime call. I mean, if the boss called me and said, "We need you now," you went now. It didn't matter what time of day or night it was.
So were you in a van or what kind of vehicle?
Plain cars. We had seized vehicles that we used, basically drug seizure type vehicles, and we had tags on them that were, registered fictitiously. We had kill switches on our brake lights, things like that. So if we were working at nighttime, we could be very covert. And like I said, we had 7 detectives. Of course, typically that meant about 5 people were working at any given time, and myself. And we locked on somebody, went onto them until we caught them.
So did you have a coffee can in the car, or did you like public indecency where you had to go into the trees?
Both. We did plenty of both. But yes, you had to keep a can with you in the car, because sometimes when you're on point, you're the point man. You can't get out and go. I mean, you're in, covertly wherever you are, waiting for somebody to go, and you can't leave. So yeah.
You got a particular case or cases in point that you might want to share with us?
Oh my gosh, there were so many, but I'll tell you one that was funny that you might enjoy. We had a guy having a burglary problem, serial burglar. He had been in prison several times for burglary. He had just gotten out a couple months ago, so we knew he was a pretty good target. And we started following him, and he had a silver car. So we followed him a day or two, picked him back up on like the second day, and all of a sudden he had a red car. Well, it was the same car, but he painted it. Which of course was a clue that he was active and he was out there doing stuff. He was trying to hide that car. And then 2 days later, this is all within a 5-day period. Now he's driving a blue car. So this guy was like his own personal Mako. He took his cans of paint out there and painted his own car 3 times while we followed him. And took us about 5 days, 5 or 6 days, and finally we followed him, caught him doing a burglary, and locked him back up. But he was Mr. Mako out there painting his car every couple of days.
That's nice. He might have been a good guy to know in case you needed your car to get painted. He probably knew how to do it.
Well, it was pretty obvious to us that he was hot. He was active because he was doing that. He was
doing that for a reason.
Yeah, he was trying to conceal his vehicle in case he got caught at a scene or whatever. So we knew it wasn't going to be long. The other fun thing about that job was you get you get a gut, you get an instinct where you just know when they're going to do the job. And after you follow somebody 2 or 3 or 4 days and you see their pattern, you get to know them a little bit, then I knew when they were going to do the deed. So we just see them doing whatever they were getting ready to do, and I'd just get on the radio because I was a sergeant. And I said, "All right, boys, here we go. We're going to do the deed right now."
You actually made the arrest. You didn't just document the crime. You went in and you made the arrest yourselves.
We did, and what we did it by strategy, because obviously when they're out there hunting or they just do a crime, they're hot, they're heated up. And that's not the best time to take them down. So we would watch them do the crime, then they would leave the scene. We would go verify that they, in fact, had done it if we didn't see them, stick a gun on somebody or something. Then we'd follow them for just a few minutes until we let them cool off just a little bit, let them settle down. And once they settled down, then we jammed them up ourselves covertly and made the arrest ourselves.
There was an old police series on TV years ago called Police Story. They had a professional football player that was in it, and they had a similar unit, but they would go into the bank robbery and, there'd be a big shootout,
Right.
That wasn't the case here.
No, we tried to avoid that, depending on how much the risk was. If we had somebody we were following that they had shot somebody before or something like that before we hooked up on them, then we tried to prevent that. I didn't want to be sitting outside a store while they went in and shot and killed somebody. So we would look for an opportunity to take them down just prior to that if we could. It had to base it on the risk to the people. I didn't want something bad to happen like that.
When we spoke earlier and you wrote something here about this, I know you took this out of your police career into your next career, but you were talking about, and I know this so well, toxic bosses. There were some great bosses. I worked for some great bosses, but the assholes were really, of course, they really stood out. You had that case. You had that situation.
Oh, absolutely. And now, one of the things that we haven't really talked about, but it's part of who I am. I grew up kind of rough, like we alluded to a little bit, and I was very familiar with abuse, even at home with my mother. My mother was very abusive, so I had to learn to deal with that. And I had a little bit of I don't tolerate abuse well. So when we got into the law enforcement business, as you said, there are a number of our supervisors and our leaders in the law enforcement business are just absolutely fantastic. I mean, some of the best leaders that you're ever going to find in anywhere, the greatest people. But we also in the law enforcement business have a toxic boss asshole problem. I mean, there's no question about it. It's everywhere you go, every jurisdiction, large and small. I've talked to people, officers from all over this country since I wrote the book, Toxic Boss Blues. And it is a problem everywhere you go, and still a problem today. So I had to experience myself in my own department. And after I retired, I decided I would write a book about it and see if I could help other people.
And that book, what's it? It's let's see, Toxic Boss Blues. Yeah, I'm looking at it here, and it's really well rated. 4.7. Have you done lectures or anything on this book? Do you work with companies so they make their bosses better, or what?
Well, I have not done that. I've not tried to do that. That certainly is a possibility, but I just haven't pursued that. I have done quite a few lectures about toxic bosses. I have the stories myself, the experiences myself, and in fact, I had a very bad experience with my own chief and my own department. And of course, there's lots of terrible stories about that. If you want to talk about one or two of them.
Well, I like to hear, how toxic he was.
Okay. Well,
is he still with us?
He's still alive, but I understand he lives in another state, and I understand he's got dementia.
I'm sorry to hear that. God bless him, but I also wish he didn't have dementia for purposes like I would love him to see this. But right. Go ahead, tell me about this guy.
Well, funny thing, in my career, I was doing very well. My career was rising. Every few years, I'd get transferred, promoted, boom, 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 boom. My career was going very well. Well, we got this new chief that came to our department. He was a deputy superintendent from the New York State Police. And he came down and he became chief of our agency. And his way of doing business was very different than the way most people would do business. I was a captain in the agency, been a captain for a little over a year. He had promoted me, matter of fact. But he had called me into his office one day and he closed the door and he asked me to do a task. And I never reveal what that task is. I think it's a little too personal, a little too close. But I do tell people that the task he asked me to do was absolutely unethical and, in my view, was immoral. So he asked me to do this task, told me to do it. And my response to him was very politely and professionally. I said, Chief, I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to implement that directive because I believe that's unethical. I said, it's outside the parameters of what I believe is right. And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to implement that. Well, when I told him that, he just absolutely lost his mind. And he jumped up out behind his chair and he started cussing and screaming and started calling me all kinds of traitor and disloyal and this, that, and the other thing. And I said, no, sir, I'm not disloyal at all. I'm just telling you, I'm not going to implement that directive because I don't believe it's right. And he lost his mind. He threw me out of his office. Well, over the course of the next 10 months, our relationship got very, very bad, really bad. He cussed me, he threatened me. At one point, he got up in my face and pointed his finger at me, and he said, I'm going to get you, you MF. He says, I'm going to get you. And I said, well, you better come big because I'm not going to roll over and play dead. And our relationship just got worse and worse. In fact, people were coming up to me, and we're talking about staff, we're talking about high-level command. People would come up to me after meetings and say things like, what is wrong? There's clearly something really wrong between you two. And, of course, I didn't share with them all of the stuff that was going on. But it went on and for about 10 months and got worse and worse and worse. It transferred me for no reason, put me in a job I didn't want to work and all that kind of stuff. It just, they were checking my emails. They were doing everything they could to try to get me like he promised he was going to. Worse and worse and worse. It was very stressful. In fact, I couldn't sleep. I gained weight. It was very stressful. I'm a high-ranking individual in this agency, had a very good career. Now, all of a sudden, the boss and I can't stand one another. So finally, after about 10 months of this, couldn't take it anymore. And at that time, I had no resources. There were no books. There was nothing about how you dealt with a toxic boss back then. And he was the chief. And of course, I was a 20-year career person at that point, had a lot to lose. So finally, he called me in one day like he typical behind closed doors, just me and him. And he started cussing me and calling me names like he always did and putting me down and said, no. He was trying to break me is what he was trying to do, but I wasn't about to stand for it. So I'd had enough of it one day after 10 months of that kind of abuse, and I'd had enough of it. So I looked him across the desk, just straight man to man, face to face. I threw my hand out and like a stop sign type thing, and I said, stop. And he looked at me and he said, you got a problem, boy? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And I laid out to him 5 of the most egregious things he had done in the 10 months prior to that, the worst of the 5.
Well, you got a good memory. You probably documented that somewhere.
They documented everything. Plus, they were so impactful, it caused me a lot of problems. So I knew it, every detail of everything. So I said, you've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, laid it out to him. I said, that's just a start. That's nowhere near all the problems. And I said, what you've done is create a hostile work environment for me. And I said, I'm not going to put up with it, not even one more second. And he said, boy, you got an attitude problem. And I said, well, you call it whatever you want. I'm telling you, this is what's going on. It stops today. I'm not putting up with it. That's what I told him. I said, if we have any more problems, I'm going to the county head, the county administrator, top guy, his boss. And I said, I'm going to kick the effing doors wide open. And he looked at me and he said, get out of my office. And he threw me out of the office. And so at that point, it was a big confrontation. But he never again, as long as he was there after that, created bad, toxic stuff for me to my face. That intervention with him actually worked as far as getting him to back off. Now, behind the scenes, a different story. He kept me from getting promoted. They assigned me jobs I didn't want to work. They gave me all the crap duties and all that. Behind the scenes, he still was messing with me. But as far as publicly, My intervention with him actually worked publicly. So he ended up leaving about 5 years later, and I ended up staying a few years after that till I retired. But because that situation was so bad, so toxic, impacted my health. And my mental health and my physical health, it was terrible. But when you have that type of power dynamic between the chief and a commander in the agency, and you're worried about your career, you're worried about everything, it really impacted me. So after I retired, I decided, there's no resources for this. Nobody really knows what to do or how to handle it. So I'm going to write a book and see if I can help others. And that's how Toxic Boss Blues came to be.
Sounds good. But you didn't just write one book. You wrote a few books here. Well, you had a run up to Toxic Boss Blues, didn't you? There's something I see here. If you're right, you fight.
Right. Well, see, that's my mantra. I adopted it even back then, which of course I fought against him. But all my life, I've had to fight for whatever I've gotten. I mean, like I told you, I've been struggling ever since I was a kid and was abused by my mother. But I've had to fight my whole life. And so I adopted the mantra of when you're right, you fight. And I use it now in my writings and my teachings. In fact, I even trademarked that phrase. I own that phrase. But everything you do in life, sometimes when you're right, you have to fight. And I've taught it to my children. Both of my children are living that way, and now I'm working on my grandchildren, teaching them that when they're right, they need to stand up and fight for it.
Did you write any fiction?
No. My second book I wrote is a true crime book, and in that particular case called Bearing Witness to Evil. And Bearing Witness to Evil was written with a crime reporter friend of mine in this area. We worked together a lot of years and been friends, and he wanted to do something with me, so I said, let's write this book. And we went through and picked out 15 crime cases through the course of my career and his that we both had some connection to. So we didn't just pick out any crime case. We went and got stuff that we actually knew something about because we were there. One of us or both of us were on that scene. And we retell the crime story, and then we tell a story behind the story. There's always things behind every crime.
Sure.
Nobody knows about. I'll give you a good example. The way that I confirmed that we were going to write that book. A friend of mine who worked for another jurisdiction in our area here, he eventually rose all the way up to number 2 guy in the agency. But I knew him through the years, different assignments and stuff. Well, he's as good a guy as you ever want to meet. Straight shooter, good cop, just as straight as they come. But the interesting thing about him is his brother is considered to be the most heinous killer in the history of the state of Virginia.
Wow.
And I knew that. I knew about his brother being that killer because his brother was convicted of stabbing a girl, raping her and killing her, stabbing her 181 times in our jurisdiction back in the time frame when I was brand new, first coming on, back in the early 80s. His brother was convicted of this rape and murder 181 times, stabbing the girl. Very heinous, terrible case. And I knew about that, but I'd never discussed it with him through the years. Well, when I thought about writing this book, I said, that would be an interesting story behind the story to tell if he'll agree to it. So I took my friend to lunch, told him what my idea was about writing a book, and I said, would it be okay to use your brother's story and use you as the story behind the story? And he said, yeah, let's do it. And that's how that book, Bearing Witness to Evil, came to be.
So it's got a bunch of cases in here. Like you said, was it 15, did you say?
There's 15 cases, very significant cases. I give you
sniper terrorists.
Yes. You remember the D.C. sniper?
Absolutely. That's just what came to my mind when I saw this on.
D.C. sniper was not but about an hour and a half from us. In fact, the last case for the sniper was in Ashland, which is not but just less than 30 minutes from where we are. So we had a lot of involvement with task force and things like that. So we were very much involved in the sniper case. So that is one of the cases that we end up talking. In fact, my friend who wrote the book with me, part of the story behind the story for him was the execution of John Muhammad and the adult sniper. And
yeah. There was an older guy and a kid.
Right.
They knocked out the back seat of their car or something like that, and they would shoot out the back by the trunk, wouldn't they?
That's exactly what they did. They had a hole. They bore a hole in the back of the trunk, and they would lay down in the back seat of the car and shoot that rifle outside that hole so that it wasn't.
You remember what year that was?
Boy, no, I really don't. I'd have to go back and check I'm not
Yeah, I
sure.
remember that really well. That was because it was always like, when's the next one?
In our jurisdiction, since we were so close, we were prepared for a case here in our jurisdiction. I mean, we assumed we'd get one of them sooner or later. And one of the funny things about that case was over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, however long it went on, I don't remember exactly, about 4 weeks or something. Over the course of 4 weeks, law enforcement actually stopped the actual snipers more than 6 times, more than half a dozen times. But they see, the issue was, if you remember back then, the issue was the public information was that it was a white van, suspect vehicle. And of course, that turns out not to be true. So the snipers themselves in the vehicle they were in, they actually got stopped in the area of the crime 6 different times before they were ever make a case against them.
What I don't remember, of course, I don't want to spoil the book, but of course, this would be common knowledge. I don't remember what their motive was. Motive was terrorism, I guess.
It was the John Muhammad, the adult sniper. His ex-wife lived in the D.C. area. So he was coming out basically to harm her, basically is why it came to this. Because they were from the state of Washington originally. And they ended up going to Alabama, some crimes, killings down there. And they ended up in Virginia and in Maryland. But it was basically a terrorism. John Muhammad was a disgruntled military person, and the young boy was just basically following him. The young boy, I think he was 15 at the time. He was a teenager anyway.
And then you've got a third book. You busy man, Rogue Justice.
Yeah.
What is Rogue Justice about?
Yeah, let me tell you one more about bearing witness before we move on.
Sure.
There's another case in there that's significant, and most if you weren't relatively local, you wouldn't know about it. But it's a serial killer case here in the late 80s in our area and in Richmond City and in Northern Virginia ended up being also. Well, the thing that's interesting about that guy ended up being identified as Timothy Spencer was his name. And we decided we would try to use DNA, and DNA evidence back then was brand new, and I mean brand new. The first case that DNA was ever used in the world was 1986 in Great Britain. This was 1987. It was very new and untested, unproven type thing. But because it was a serial killer case and we had physical evidence from each case, we had 5 cases in all, and we had physical evidence. One of the prosecutors said, let's try this DNA thing. So sure enough, Timothy Spencer was convicted based largely upon the DNA. That was pretty much the only evidence there was against him. And he ended up being the first person in the world to be executed based on DNA evidence. Well, Timothy Spencer's got a little special place in the book as well.
Wow, yeah, he is a milestone case, I guess. Huh?
Yeah. So we tried to pick out 15 cases like that for bearing witness to evil, some things that were significant and true crime people would enjoy.
So that's why there were 2 names on that book. I noticed that. And then this Rogue Justice. Does this also have to do with real stuff?
Well, yes, it does, but rogue justice really is part of my when you're right, you fight philosophy. One night, a couple years ago, a friend of mine and I were having a conversation about various different things, and we started talking about philosophies on life and how we look at things, how we do things like that. And next thing you know, I started seeing the concepts for rogue justice in my mind. And I actually wrote the outline of that book that night during that conversation. I said, well, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this. And that's how rogue justice came to be. But what rogue justice is I take the term rogue, which typically is considered to be a bad thing, but I flip it around and I make a pretty strong case that actually the greatest leaders, the greatest achievers in the history of the world actually had to go rogue to get that done. Now, to be what I call a rogue justice warrior, you have to be honorable and principled. And I talk about in the book what a rogue justice warrior is. But that's the distinction between being a rogue, who's a bad guy, but a rogue justice warrior is somebody who is willing to bend the rules, go outside the box, and do whatever has to be done to get it done, but they're honorable and principled. I make a pretty strong case in the book about if you really want to be a successful leader and be the best of the best, you've got to go rogue sometimes. Sometimes you got to get out of the box and say,
yeah,
we're not doing
I agree.
that. I mean, that's wrong. We're not doing it. and we're going to go this way. So that's what rogue justice is all about. It's about how to do that, how to go rogue, how to be strong, how to stand up, how you need to be principled.
I'm not going rogue next week because, I'm pretty old. And like I said,
Right.
I'm 79 and a quarter or something like that. So who is the best audience for this book, Rogue Justice?
Great question. It's going to be anybody really, but the people that identify it the most are like law enforcement, military, people who are used to having to make tough decisions. And sometimes those decisions are not easy. But anybody can be a rogue justice warrior. I'll give you an example. Sometimes teachers get put in positions where they have to make tough choices and tough calls, and they have to do the right thing. Sometimes a preacher might be put in that position. A medical personnel sometimes get in a position where they have to stand up and do the right thing. So anybody can be a rogue justice warrior. And I think the people that would be the most interested in the book are people who either have or are still currently having to make those really tough decisions.
How about young people?
Well, I would love for the young people to read it because it certainly could impact them. So do they have the experience to understand it? I'm not sure.
I got you.
I'm not sure because they probably haven't had to make those same tough decisions, most of them yet. But it certainly could be beneficial to them, there's no question. But it's all about standing strong, doing the right thing. I'll give you an example. On the back cover of Rogue Justice, I list about 8 or 10 things that you might hear a Rogue Justice warrior say. And one of the things that I list on there is that a Rogue Justice warrior might say is, "Oh, hell no." No,
hell no.
We're not doing that.
Yeah, hell no.
That's right. I ain't doing that. Right. Another one of the things you might hear rogue justice warriors say is, "No, we're not doing that." No.
That's true.
Right. Right. So that's kind of what it's all about. I personally, it's new. Justice is new out on the market. I haven't had reviews or anything on it yet. It's only been out a couple of months. But I actually really, really like that book, and I hope a few people will decide to get it.
Well, that's great. And that's a pretty good conversation. I enjoyed myself. I hope you enjoyed being here.
Yes, Ted. I enjoyed the conversation, and I tell you, anybody who does happen to see the podcast and maybe they'd like a little help on toxic boss or something like that, I certainly will help anybody, anywhere, anytime.
Well, what's contact for you?
Well, they can contact me with the email, is Steve Neal at toxicbossblues.com. And like I said, I help people regularly. People from all over the country will send me a message and say, "Hey, I got this bad thing going on. What do I do?"
Sounds great. Sounds great. Well, thank you again.
Old school.